Hi, this is Deborah Deal, Chairman of Jeffco International Women's Day and the Nine Power Foundation.
And I am Juliette Abdel, your Miss Colorado for America 2020 and President of the Westminster Chamber of Commerce.
Women's Equality Day is important to us, and I'm positive it is important to you too. Juliette is going to walk us through a quick history of women's right to vote, and we will also hear from the Honorable George Stern, the elected clerk and recorder for one of Colorado's largest counties, Jefferson County. Juliette?
As many of you are aware, August 26th is the official day commemorating the passage of the 19th Amendment 100 years ago by the U.S. Congress, granting women the right to vote. Now, more than ever, when many social conversations are taking place nationwide, today's celebration is not only timely, it is relevant. So, how did we get here? The 19th Amendment was first introduced in 1878. In 1971, the U.S. Congress designated August 26th as Women's Equality Day. In addition to not being able to vote, there were a lot of other inequalities that have been overcome, and I'd like to point those out. We should celebrate those as well for this important day. For example, until relatively recently, women couldn't sue for sexual harassment, and sexual discrimination was common in the workplace. By 1900, every state passed legislation granting married women the right to keep their own wages and to own property in their own name. Until the 1970s, unmarried women would have a very difficult time getting a credit card from a bank, even though some states had already implemented a no-fault divorce law. In 1965, the Supreme Court established the right of married couples to use contraceptives just 3 years after pharmacological contraceptives became widely available. However, as late as 1978, they could be fired for being pregnant. Many colleges, especially Ivy League institutions, would not allow women in, no matter how bright they were, and they couldn't join the military until 1948. In many states, women couldn't serve on juries, and of course, they couldn't vote. The battle to obtain the right to vote for women is often noted as beginning in 1878, when the 19th Amendment was first presented to Congress, although it began many years before that, when abolitionists in the late 1830s began to advocate for women's rights as well. The continual discrimination prompted them to band together to promote a new, separate women's rights movement. And American women were not alone in their plight, since laws adopted here were mimicking the English rule. The British women were in their own battle for women's rights. During those years before 1878, supporters for women's suffrage wrote, lectured, marched, lobbied, and pushed the envelope of social norms to achieve this profound change. Once the amendment was first presented to Congress, supporters worked endlessly. Some champions of the cause tried to get suffrage acts passed in each state, and they occasionally succeeded. Western states were the most accepting. Wyoming, Utah, Idaho had achieved full suffrage for women by the 20th century, but Colorado stood out. Colorado's own suffrage movement began to gain traction in the 1870s. In 1893, Colorado became the first American state to enact women's suffrage by popular referendum. The act granted women the right to vote in the same manner in all respects as male persons are. By 1914, victory was secured in a total of 11 states, all of them in the West. In the other areas of the country, the right for women to vote did not progress so quickly. In some states, the tactic was to challenge male-only voting rights in the courts. But the battle went well beyond the courts. Families fought and marriages suffered. In the end, it came down to more public displays of support for the amendment before Congress. Many marches, parades, and silent vigils were held. Marchers were heckled and sometimes met abusive opposition. Supporters of women's rights to vote were often jailed and physically abused. They were beaten both in the streets and in jail. When they went on hunger strikes, they were brutally force-fed. In March 1913, before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, a demonstration led by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns was held in front of the Capitol in support of the right to vote. Although the women were peacefully protesting, the women were harassed and beaten savagely by a crowd who were against suffrage. This instance did not stop women, however. Just 3 years later, the first woman was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, Jeannette Rankin. People today often think of the movement for women's suffrage as being conducted by one cohesive group. But in fact, this movement had 3 phases with a defined purpose for each. Different groups made up the movement, each with their own tactics, but with one core objective: to win the right to vote. Leaders and champions of the effort to get voting rights are still remembered today. In addition to Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, we should recognize Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Ida B. Wells, Lucy Stone, and many, many more. Susan B. Anthony, whose likeness was placed on the U.S. dollar coin in 1979, is perhaps the most famous. Oddly, this now accepted heroine in American history was once tried for illegal voting. Colorado. Most notable was the Territorial Women's Suffrage Society, which later became the Women's Suffrage Association of Colorado. And there was also the nonpartisan Equal Suffrage Association. Battle for suffrage in Colorado was tough, as it was in most states, and went on for years. Finally, on November 7, 1983, a referendum on women's suffrage was held in Colorado that secured women's voting rights. We were the first state in the union to provide for those rights by popular referendum. Almost 36,000 voted in favor of the action, while 29,000 voted against it. Another standout moment for Colorado: the year after Colorado's women won the right to vote, 3 Colorado women, Clara Cressingham, Carrie Clyde Hawley, and Frances Clock, became the first women to be elected to any state legislature in U.S. history when they were elected to the Colorado House of Representatives. So in Colorado, women were being elected to the state legislature, while most states denied women even the right to vote. Finally, the rest of the country came around, and on May 21, 1919, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the 19th Amendment, and 2 weeks later, the Senate followed. When Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment on August 18, 1920, the amendment was adopted, and women throughout the country had the right to vote.
My name is George Stern. I'm the clerk and recorder here in Jefferson County, which means I run elections in our largest swing county here in the state, and I want to wish you a happy Women's Equality Day. I'm wearing my Constitution tie for the occasion, We the People. Women's Equality Day, of course, commemorates when the 19th Amendment was added to our Constitution 100 years ago. 100 years ago, that 19th Amendment made sure that no one could have their right to vote abridged or denied based on sex, and adding that to our Constitution 100 years ago made the phrase "we the people" a lot more meaningful to almost half of our population. We've come a long way in 100 years. Today in Colorado, despite the fact that there are more men than women in the state, we have far more women registered to vote and active voter registrants here in Colorado. So we're grateful for that. We want to keep working to expand voter access throughout the state. We're going to keep doing that work every day. We ask you to join us in those efforts. But for now, just want to wish you a happy Women's Equality Day.
Thank you, George. Colorado was a leader in women's right to vote and in other ways. We have much to be grateful here in our great state. After the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1919, decades of struggle for the voting rights of African American and other minority women were still ahead for our country. But it was a good first step. The face of the American electorate had changed forever, and the way was paved for more change. I am Juliette Abdel.
And I'm Deborah Deal. Thank you for your time, and please join us in celebrating Women's Equality Day. It was a long battle for women to get the right to vote. Let's all honor those who fought this battle for us by voting in this upcoming election and in all elections.